My name is Emily Lawrence. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Museum of Old Newbury, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our talk, Slavery in Massachusetts, with Susan McGregor Harvey. We were overwhelmed by this wonderful response to tonight's program, and we thank all of you for being here tonight. The issue of the history of slavery in our own community is, of course, something that can be hard to grapple with, but it's so nice to see so many people who are not only willing to have these difficult conversations, but eager to and to learn from them. So thank you for being here tonight. I see a lot of new faces in the audience, so if you've never been to the museum before, I do encourage you to pick up a calendar of events program booklet on your way out. They're on the back table. This is one of 30 programs we have in the calendar for this year, so there is something for everyone. So do pick up a booklet, and there's membership information in there as well if you'd like to become a member of the museum and support great programming like this. Our speaker tonight is Susan McGregor Harvey. Susan teaches history at Littleton High School. She is a descendant of the Morse family, one of the first settlers' families here in Newbury. And her interest in this topic was spurred by her own curiosity about her family's involvement in the economic implications of the slave trade here in Newburyport throughout history. And from that little kernel of curiosity grew this extensive and meticulously researched study about slavery here in our community. So let's welcome Susan Harvey.
Thank you, Emily. As Emily said, I am a high school teacher. I teach U.S. history, and I teach a course called Facing History and Ourselves. We look at the genocides of the 20th century. That's another area of interest for my research, but we're not going there tonight. That's another lecture. This is my second career. I was in medical administration for 25 years, so I didn't start teaching until I was 50. So my master's thesis was done not all that long ago. Somebody questioned me today when I said I was giving a talk. Oh, well, that master's thesis was a long time ago. No, it wasn't actually. 2012. So that's who I am. As Emily said, I am a direct descendant of the Morse family. I will talk a little bit more about that because my husband is a direct descendant of the Bartlett family. They arrived the same year. Yes. So this is my daughter in the front, and she's got it all. So yeah. So let's talk about resources. Let's see if I can do this. All right. So as Emily said, I wanted to know something about what my family did with the slave trade, and to find out what they did, their impact, and how it impacted Newburyport. So the archives in the Newburyport Public Library completely rock. It is just such a wonderful space, and everyone there was very, very, very helpful. Now, I am not from New England. I live in Littleton now, but I grew up in Ohio. And, I had learned about our Newbury connections when I was in 8th grade, and I began to be interested in genealogy. And so it took quite a while to get me out here, but I have lived in New England now for most of my life. One of the things that I learned when I was doing my master's thesis was how to read probate inventories, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And I brought a copy of the thesis because in the back, even though you can get the thesis online, in the back are copies of the probate inventories that I use, so you can see for yourself what they look like. And I used a lot of other primary and secondary sources. As a history teacher who teaches how to do research papers, you need to know that where I got my stuff. So, yeah. So on my father's side, Anthony Morse and his brother William came from England, and they arrived in Newbury in 1635. 16 generations later, in 1806, Anthony's descendant, Moses Noyes Morse, married Hannah Sanborn. So I am a descendant of John Sanborn as well. And I'm a direct descendant of the Morse and Tuck and Batchelder families, because my mother's family was the Tuck family and the Batchelder family. They came through here, and then they went to Hampton and settled Hampton. Mr. Batchelder was the Reverend Stephen Batchelder, and if anybody has ever read The Scarlet Letter, that awful minister based on him. He was a randy guy, got married 4 times, and died at 98. Yeah. Okay. So, here's Stephen Batchelder. Grandsons John and William, they stopped in Watertown, they came here, and people in Newbury said, keep going. He actually got into some serious legal trouble because he married one woman before divorcing the other one. And then Stephen's daughter, Joanna, married Robert Tock, and they settled in Hampton. Married John Sanborn, and I've got the Philbricks in there, and it's a lot. It's a lot, yeah. So, let's talk about this peculiar institution. Not so peculiar. It was in all 13 colonies. It is a universal feature of human history. It's in the Old Testament. I mean, slavery is as old as humankind. Slavery here was done differently.
Can you speak up?
I'm so sorry. I will try. I do have a mic here, but can I put this on? No?
It's just going to the camera.
Oh, sugar. Okay, sorry. Sorry, I'll try. So in most societies, slaves were taken as prisoners of war and then put to work. That's not what happened with African slavery in this country. Very, very different. And slaves were outsiders. They were excluded from any kind of basic rights. It is the cornerstone of the colonization of all of the Americas. And before 1800, 10 million human beings crossed the Atlantic. That's beyond, I can't count that high, it's huge. 8.5 million of those people were enslaved Africans. Most of them were taken to the sugar colonies in the Caribbean. Now you think, oh, well, okay, they went to the Caribbean. How does that impact us? I will show you. 500 to 600,000 of them were imported to the mainland. But it's not so much that we had slaves or didn't have slaves. So here's a timeline, very brief. 1400s, the Portuguese actually start this. And they are taking people off the west coast of Africa. In 1510, shipments of Africans are to the Spanish and then are coming to the New World. If you've been paying attention to the news recently, 1619 is 400 years ago from this year, and so we are celebrating, in quotes, the 400th anniversary of the first slaves coming to the United States. They came as Angolan slaves. They arrived in Virginia, and they were on a Dutch man-of-war that had been captured by the Spanish. In 1624, Samuel Maverick, and if anybody's ever been on the Blue Line in Boston, it's Maverick Station, right? Kept slaves in what is now in East Boston. So this is the sign that is in the Custom House Maritime Museum in Newburyport. I am assuming that at least some of you have been in there. It's a wonderful museum. I think I should say before I go any further, I love Newburyport, okay? And everybody here has been marvelous. This is a tough history, so some people don't like hearing it, but nonetheless, that's part of what I have to do. So this is right as you walk in the door. And I happened to be standing there as some women walked in, and one of them sort of did this. Oh, the triangle trade. I get that. But there weren't any slaves here. So how does that fit here? Well, there were, but that's really not the issue. She's trying to explain it. She's not looking at the fact that the ships were built here that traded human beings. The ships, why Mr. Bartlett made so much money and had that beautiful house on Federal Street is still there, is because he ran ships to the Caribbean monthly. All right? He took everything that was here and took it down there and brought the rum and molasses back and the sugar. That's how he made his money. So we didn't have tobacco. We didn't have cotton. We didn't have any of that. So everybody says, oh, well, we didn't have slavery because it doesn't look the same way as the South. No, of course it doesn't. It's very different here. It's the economy and the production and consumption of sugar in itself wasn't fitting into her equation. So when we begin to look at the aspects of the slave trade from rum and ships, we can then start to peel back the layers and look at the deeper involvement of the entire community. So African slaves should have been included in the sign because everybody did benefit. Now, there's your triangle. Not so much a triangle. You can see up here, now if I can make this gizmo work. Okay, so these are our fishing colonies. That's us, okay? And we are sending things here, but we're sending a lot down here and going back and forth. That's where most of the economy came from. Okay. Now, one of the reasons that the Caribbean islands were such a good place to be doing this is because this is a prime place for growing sugar. Okay, well, sugar became an important part in the economy. You couldn't do anything without sugar. And they weren't growing anything but sugar. Well, how do you feed people? You send cod. You send dried salt cod. The lowest kind, because the good stuff is going here, okay? The good stuff is going to Spain and Portugal and the Catholic countries. The bottom of the barrel, as we say, cod, dried salt cod, was going down to the Indies to feed the slaves. And the wood, the timber, to build the houses was going down. And the Narragansett horses were going down. And all of the produce was going down. So, how did we do this? Well, we start importing slaves in 1638. And we're exchanging Native Americans who are really not good slaves at all. They don't like to obey, and smartly. And we are trading them for black slaves from the West Indies. 1641, we begin trading fish and pipe staves for Spanish wine and sugar. 1644, Boston traders sent 3 ships to Africa, and they were exchanged in the West Indies for wine and salt and sugar and tobacco. Oh, this is making us money. What a good idea. So it is enshrined in law. I hate to say this, but Massachusetts is the first colony to put this into law, to say it is legal to own another human being. It is in our body of liberties, 1641. When I talk about this in my classroom, and I do, the thread of my US 1 class is slavery. We talk about the fact that this is chattel property. That chair, this desk, I can do anything with it I want. I own it. I can move it where I want to. I can destroy it if I want to. If it's valuable, I'm not going to destroy it. I probably wouldn't destroy this, okay? This is too nice and too valuable to me, so I'm not going to destroy that. But it doesn't mean I'm going to take great care of it either. So in 1660, we changed things. And one of the interesting things here is that we don't start out immediately enslaving Africans. Those Africans that came in 1619 weren't immediately your slaves. In fact, they became just yeomen. They had their own land to work. And some of them owned slaves. But by the time we get into the late 1600s, all of the people with dark skin are now slaves. And it changed from the husband, the man who has a child, and that is your descendant, and that child is slavery, to the mother. I think you can imagine why. Even my sophomores can figure this out, okay? Yeah. So you can create more property by impregnating your slaves. This is how it reads in the 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties. So this is from one of the wonderful books that I was using. It's Joshua Coffin's book. And he states that prior to 1700, the number of slaves was small here in Newburyport, although a large proportion of the wealthy families had one or more. And they were bought and sold without scruple by all classes of people. And the purchase of slaves from the Caribbean to work on farms in New England increased as the arrival of the white indentured servants dropped off. Now that has a lot to do with what was going on back in England too. Okay, if you have any idea about English history, one of the reasons we have something called the Great Migration with all the Puritans coming is because they were not in favor with the Anglican Church. Well, Charles has his head cut off, and all of a sudden everything's not all that bad anymore. But the Episcopalians start coming, okay, because things are not good for them. So lots of things are happening here, and it gets less okay to come as an indentured servant. So fewer and fewer white indentured servants are coming, but we're now having more and more slaves come. And of course, if anybody knows anything about economics, the more there are, the cheaper they are, right? Walmart. Okay. So this is from the court files in Salem. And it is Anne Hills, who is a sometime servant. She was a slave to Abraham Toppin. And she talks about the voyages he makes to Barbados. And some of them were profitable, and these are the things that he brought back. And he testified that in his last voyage, he brought home 8 barrels and 1 hogshead of sugar and 200,000 or 300,000 pounds of cotton wool. What's he going to do with all that cotton wool? Well, he's going to sell it, isn't he? Yeah. So. This is our census. Our very first census in New England. It's a hot topic these days, census. Nobody was asking if they were citizens or not. 1715, there were approximately 158,000 white residents and 4,150 blacks in the entire region. This is how it works out. About 2,000 in Massachusetts. So, in this one, Newbury had 50 slaves, of whom 16 were female and 34 male. Salem had 83, Gloucester 61, and in 1764, they accounted for 1,070 people in Essex County. There's a wonderful book. I did make a list. Did I give that to you? Okay. I brought along a list of books that I thought might be useful to some of you who want to read on about this. Some of which are in my thesis. Some are very new, so I didn't even get to use those. But one of the best ones is The Negro in Colonial New England, and written by Lorenzo Green. And he lists 162 leading slaveholding families in colonial New England. Of the 54 families found in Massachusetts, 7 of the leading families were in Newbury. They were the Coffins, Joseph Coffin, Nathaniel Coffin, Moses Garish, Richard Greenleaf, Samuel Moggridge, Henry Rolfe, and Henry Short. Minnie Atkinson added some more in her 1933 History of the First Religious Society of Newburyport. William Johnson, Moses Titcomb, Edmund Greenleaf, Ezekiel Chase, and several others. And they added into their not inconsiderable wealth, as she put it. Oh, buttons. Okay. So, how did I find this information? Well, I was explaining to Sharon that it was circumstances, but it was all about the archives. And if anybody has worked in the archives, you know that they close down for lunch for about an hour. Okay. So then you're sort of left on your own to figure out what to do. So I go and get a quick lunch and then go up into the stacks. And one day I found a book from the Dublin Seminar. Peter Benes, B-E-N-E-S, was the publisher of this. And this one happened to have a very interesting article on the sleeping arrangements in Essex County. That should catch your eye. Okay, so I thought, well, I'll just look through this, right? And I love footnotes. I'm such a geek. And there's this little footnote. And the footnote's huge. It's half the page. And it said all of this material came from these probate inventories collected by these people. Well, these people are Newbury people. And they had decided for whatever reason to do this. And so after, when I could get back in there, I ran down to the archivist, Jessica Gill at the time, and I said, Jessica, how do we find these? She called the Historical Society, and they said, we have no idea what you're talking about. So then she called Peter Benes, bless her heart, and he said, yeah, I have them. What do you mean you have them? This is 2011. And he said, yeah, I have them. And she said, well, I have a researcher who really, really needs these. She used the word thirsting, is thirsting for these. So he said, I don't know if I can give them to her. And she pleaded, and she pleaded. And he said, okay, but she has to come get them. Okay, I'll drive anywhere for these. And he turns out he lived in Concord at the time. Well, I live in Littleton. This is a piece of cake. So I drive over, and here is this elderly man in the garden. And he said, oh, yeah, I have them. Come on in the house. And I follow him up to his bedroom. And there they are in a bookshelf, just in a manila folder. Other stuff on top of them. And I'm thinking, this is crazy. And he said, I guess I should have you sign for them. Well, he had been babysitting for his grandchildren, so I signed with a crayon. Put them in my car and drove straight back to Newburyport and said, look what I have. Yes, so and then at the end of my research, I made sure that a copy stayed in the archives and a copy went to the Historical Society. Anyway, so that's who did this. Do any of you know these people? Okay, all right. Well, really, really, really interesting. I was able to speak, I call them the Lunt inventories, just because that's how it starts. I did get to speak with Harriet Gould before she died. And she was the last one alive, and I said, why did you choose these people? Because it's like 675 people. This is a lot. This was a huge number of people who lived here. And I couldn't actually get out of her why these people were chosen and others were not. But they are a good representation of the town. They just went through them, and they did not go through them in any kind of methodical way. There's red marker, there's, not archival, let's put it that way. But they were marvelous to use. Now, for those of you who do not know what a probate inventory is, a probate inventory, oh, heavens to Betsy.
Next again.
What have we done?
Next.
Hit next again. Ah, okay. Thank you. Okay. So a probate inventory, it's taken right after an individual's death. And say 3 selectmen, 3 people who are important in the town, come in and count everything you have and ascribe a value to everything that you have. This is an example of one of them. And as I say, I brought some with the thesis so you could see the ones that I actually used. And this is movable goods. This is the clothes that the deceased has. This is the debts the deceased has. Everything. And so I could find out that the gentleman in question, there's always a gentleman, owned a portion of a boat or owned several portions of boats, and we'll get to that in a bit. So you could get a list of cooking utensils, but not the oven, because that's in the house, right? So that sort of thing. Well, what's interesting is you start in the 1600s, and these things are just all higgledy-piggledy. So you've got literally the oxen next to the kitchen dishes, you know. And as we get into the 19th century, they're done by room. You can read them. The S's don't look like F's anymore, that sort of thing. So it takes some getting used to look at these things, but I wanted to give you an example of what they look like. So here is something from Samuel Moody's. George Little and Benjamin Rolfe are the appraisers. He had real estate of 1,342 pounds. In his personal goods, he had a Negro boy worth 25 pounds. And his total value of his estate was 1,838, 3 pence and 8 shillings. So that's actually a lot of money at that time. Captain Paul White, one of my favorite individuals in this, he had a warehouse with 4,000 pounds of sugar, 2 hogsheads of salt, as you can see, hogshead of molasses, a lot of rum. Okay, 2 still worms for distilling that rum. He had a shop. He had a wharf. Okay, 84 gallons of rum. He had a place in Barbados. His entire estate was worth $424,873 in 2016 dollars. He was a very, very wealthy man. Now, my ancestor, Anthony Morse, was not in this group for whatever reason. But I found his microfiche will and his probate, and he owed Paul White money. So he was a farmer, I know that. Did his goods go to the Caribbean? I don't know that. But he took part in this economy. He was drinking the rum, right? Okay. So.
What's a worm?
A worm is the, what a great question. And I should have said this before. If you've got a question, just do it. It's that spiral thingy, you know, that gizmo that connects to the actual container, and then it gets evaporated out, right? So that's think distilling in, you know, moonshine. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, and when we say an ordinary, he had an ordinary, and an ordinary is a tavern. So he owned the tavern too. He had 1 Negro worth 30 pounds, a great deal of money. Now this next guy, Richard Dole, this was in his will. So he gave his slaves to his children as property, of course. Now his Negro servant Betty, he said, after 2 years, you can be free. Now, when you think about what jobs people did, that slaves did. Oh, let's go back to Richard for a second. Let me talk about this before I get into ships. They were house servants. They were farm labor. But other jobs were also held by African slaves. They were used as laborers, skilled carpenters, because as we begin to get into shipbuilding, which is the next piece of this, you need to have people who actually know what they're doing to build the ships. So they are brought on as sort of journeymen, and they learn the trade, and then they are being rented out for their skills. So these are not necessarily, I mean, they're certainly not doing cotton plantation, right? They may be working on farms, but more of them begin to be skilled laborers. They actually have trades. So let's talk.
Were they taught to read, and did they have?
Great question. That's a great question, because we know in the South it was against the law to teach slaves how to read. If you think about, well, and we also know that in New England there was a higher literacy rate among everybody than any other place in the country, because you needed to read the Bible. That was primarily why. Slaves may have been taught to read. It would depend on the family. I don't believe there was any proscription against it, but it's certainly not in the South, you know, that same thing, because you were afraid of insurrections and you were afraid that they would attack you and they would whatever. That wasn't the same here. So whether they could read or not, I actually do not know that, and it probably varied by family. If you were wealthy, possibly. Phyllis, does anybody know about Phyllis Wheatley?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Phyllis Wheatley was obviously taught how to read, and then, you know, helped along in her poetic career. I mean, you know, so kind of depended on the family, I think. Good question. Okay, so let's talk about ships. So between 1709 and 1714, Newbury produced 28 sloops, 2 barks, 11 brigantines, and 11 ships totaling over 2,000 tons. More than Salem, which I think surprises a lot of people. Newbury in this period launched almost as much tonnage as it had in the previous 6 years by 1714. And they continued to build both coastal and ocean-going vessels. Good book on shipbuilding in New England, Joseph Goldenberg. He suggests that cheap construction rates probably explain the increase in building in Newbury. If you have slaves who are doing the work, you're not paying them the wage you would be paying a white man. And timber was more plentiful than it was in Boston. Okay, so let's look at ship ownership. They pooled their funds. As I said, sometimes you would see somebody with a portion of a ship that was in their probate inventory. Some owned full ships. Most of them shared this. They pooled their resources to do this. And it was based on your connections, right? So 1 out of every 6 adult males in Newbury in 1710 was a part owner of a vessel. And this was common and became something that all levels of society engaged in. Edward Randolph. This is something that he wrote, and this idea of sharing, you know, does spread the financial risk of launching a ship, and it also helped. I mean, if there was a risk, there might also be a substantial gain, right? And that's what they were banking on. Early form of gambling, I guess. I don't know. But this is where all of these things came from. This is another probate inventory. He has quite a lot of money. He had a half right in the Long Wharf warehouse and a 16th part of a sloop, about 80 tons. And under his household furniture, he had 2 saddles and a bridle and a Negro woman. That was furniture. An entire page in shop goods that included gloves and threads and all of these other luxury items that were being purchased by people in Newbury, which you're getting because you have money in the slave trade. Mr. John Crocker Jr. He has also a lot of goods that are being sold. He also has quite a bit of molasses and 400 gallons of coffee and allspice. He owns 1/8 of the duck schooner and 1 1/2 and 1/3 of the sloop, and the name is left out. Okay. So at the time of the Revolution, the population of Newburyport was about 3,000 people. There were about 699 adult males, and of them, the occupations of 84.7% of them were ascertained by a local resident scholar, Bernard Laborie, whom you may know, and the following is from his book, Patriots and Partisans, the Merchants of Newburyport, 1764 to 18, oh, heavens to Betsy. There we go. Okay, here we are. So this is what people in Newburyport were doing for a living. How many of you sail? Raise your hand if you sail. Okay. There's a lot of parts to a boat, right? And you probably didn't have anything nearly as big as this, or perhaps you do, I don't know. Ours is 17 feet, so, you know, it's a Cape Cod cat boat. It doesn't go very fast either. All of these things would have to be put on that ship to make it ready to go on an ocean voyage. Every part of the society here was involved. So the people that Mr. Laborie designated as merchants and professional men, 14 distillers, 36 merchants, 83 shipmasters, and 27 shopkeepers and innholders. Do we have that many now? Right. I mean, that's a lot of traffic. Think about this for a minute. A lot of people coming in and out and having to stay here while they're getting ready for their ship to leave. Right. Okay. Rum. Okay. Newburyport is not big. 10 rum distilleries. 10. Salem only had 5. Rhode Island had 30. Rhode Island actually is more complicit in the slave trade than any New England state. We'll get into that. But this is huge. 912,000 gallons of rum that we exported. It went to Africa. It was payment for slaves.
Who were they paying? Who were they paying rum to in Africa?
The Africans who had decided that it was a lucrative business to entrap other Africans from other tribes and bring them to the coast. So you would, the English traders or the Spanish traders or the Portuguese traders would make deals with these African tribe leaders, and they'd say, we need so many, and we'll give you rum, and we'll give you handkerchiefs, and we'll give you something. We'll give you some luxury good. And rum was really the currency. And then they would get those people. And the awful thing about this is that that ship didn't leave the west coast of Africa until the captain had enough people. So they would just be put on the ship and they would be sitting there or lying there until enough people were there, until enough Africans were put on.
In chains.
Yeah.
In chains.
In chains. Oh, absolutely, in chains. Yes. Yes. So, much of the rum that was made in Newburyport, some of it, was sold locally to residents, as in my ancestor. But we also had a lucrative trade with the Indians, and it kept the fisheries alive because there was no article that could take the place of rum in the trade with the West Indies and with the slaves. Nothing beat that. So on the eve of the American Revolution, there were 140 rum distilleries in North America. Most of them were in New England. Now, in 1764, we know that Newburyport was set off from Newbury. But at that time, it could claim 10, Newburyport, 10. It was 630 acres, less than a square mile. And you had 10 rum distilleries. It was the smallest town in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Are we talking Newbury or Newburyport?
Newburyport. And the only town that had more was Boston. New England exports of rum to Africa represented over 4/5 of the total colonial exports of rum in 1770. So, sugarcane plantation. This obviously wasn't taken in the 1700s because photography wasn't invented yet. But this continued for a long time. Rum was ideal because it was easy to transport, it could be warehoused cheaply, withstood any climate, improper handling, and increased value as it aged. Okay? So, I want to talk a minute about this. So many slaves were brought to the West Indies to do sugar, to grow sugar, to cut sugar. And they really weren't feeding them anything but, as I said, dried salt cod for protein and some vegetables that were coming down from New England. It was cheaper to replace the slaves when they died, and the average lifespan of somebody working sugar was 7 years.
Oh my gosh.
And it was cheaper to replace them. So let's look. All right. This is a 1764 statement of the Massachusetts Trade and Fisheries. I don't know if you can read all of this. Asserting that sugar and molasses were the main ingredients of the slave trade, the merchants claimed that any duty imposed upon these articles would ruin the fisheries, cause the destruction of the rum distilleries, and destroy the slave trade. Destruction of the Negro commerce would throw 5,000 seamen out of employment and would cause almost 700 ships to rot in idleness at their wharves. Not only would it affect those immediately engaged in these industries, but its blighting effects would topple the whole dependent economic structure. Coopers, tanners, barrel makers, and even farmers would be reduced to poverty and misery if the act were enforced. In short, the Sugar Act, which I'm sure you know something about if you know anything about the acts that sort of led us to revolution, the Sugar Act, by destroying the slave trade, would stop the wheels of New England industry. No wonder we protested. Yeah. This is the statement from the Massachusetts Trade and Fisheries, right? Okay. So these are vessels built in Newbury, used for slave voyages. There were 47 ships from 1734 to 1858. That date should alarm you. The transatlantic slave trade was prohibited by federal law in 1808. Right. So when you are looking at the transatlantic slave trade database, which is a marvelous site, after 1808, the name of the captain is blank. The name of the crew is blank. Right? Yeah. So total slaves embarked on the ships that were built in Newbury, 22,629, disembarked 19,037. That means the difference between them, those people died on what we call the Middle Passage across the Atlantic. 3 ships were condemned. We do not know how many people died. But that's how many slaves died on those voyages. They may not have been owned by Newbury porters. They may have been partially owned by Newbury porters, but they were built here. And a slave ship is different than any other ship. There are other things that have to be done to it to make sure that slaves don't escape and that there are barriers put in. You can't mistake a slave ship for some other ship. They were specialized. We were talking about this a little earlier. I was with somebody. This is the Brooks. Launched in 1781, made famous in 1788. There are posters of these, okay? And this indicates, let me see if I can get this gizmo working. These are the layers of people, okay? And this is how they are laid. One of the original ones of these is in the Peabody Essex Museum. These were printed and distributed by abolitionists. This is when the abolitionist movement really began. It began in England. And it came here. No, it's horrifying. It's like pieces of lumber. So here is our abolition timeline. Massachusetts, the first to enshrine slavery in law, also is the first to say no. Okay, but it was because a couple of slaves brought cases to court. And it was found that slavery was unconstitutional in Massachusetts. Our Constitution in Massachusetts is the oldest written constitution in the world. And the United States Constitution is based in large part on the Massachusetts Constitution. So it was against the law. So we said, okay, I guess you have to be free. Well, 1787, we talk about postponing this. Now, this is a big talk, and we actually debate this in my classroom about whether we should be abolishing slavery or not. When it makes this much money, how do you do that? Do you just let the slaves go all of a sudden because it's the right thing to do? Do you do it gradually? Well, in order to get the Constitution ratified, the Northerners, who were pretending at this point to be all abolitionists, not so much, knew that the Southern states would not sign on. They would not be a part of the Constitution. And then what's that revolution for? So we said, okay, well, let's just not talk about it for 20 years. Okay. Because by then, it'll die out. Guess what happened in 1793?
Cotton gin.
Thank you. The cotton gin was invented. And it made cotton production so much faster that actually we needed more slaves now. But 1807, Britain outlaws the slave trade. Done. 1808, January 1st, we prohibit the importation of slaves. Well, what does that mean for the slaves who are here? They become more valuable, right? Okay. And creating more slaves, however you need to do that, also increases. Britain completely abolishes slavery in 1833. Well, we don't do that until after a bloody civil war where we have lost 750,000 Americans. And we have an amendment to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, to do so. What happens in Reconstruction is another lecture. So, Vermont says, yeah, we're not going to have any slavery in our Constitution. Well, they aren't really a state quite yet. Pennsylvania, gradual abolition. In Pennsylvania, and this is a curious thing, because Pennsylvania basically said, if you are a slave and you are living here for more than 6 months, you're free. Where was our first White House? Philadelphia. Who was our first president? George Washington. Did he have slaves in Philadelphia? You betcha. And just before the 6 months was up, he would send them back to Mount Vernon and get other ones. Our Supreme Court said, can't do it, it's unconstitutional in 1783. So New Hampshire, fuzzy. But it's gradual. Rhode Island is gradual. Connecticut is gradual. New York is gradual. Because of the economic impact. And by this time, we have convinced ourselves that people with dark skin are somehow less intelligent and somehow not as worthy. Okay. So this is from a report in 1906, a Newbury Custom House records, talking about the commerce between the West Indies and Newburyport, and the different places that they went, and the importation of molasses and sugar from Guadalupe principally was an important trade, but most everything of foreign production came to this port. If it comes to this port, somebody has to be buying it. So we may be purchasing it here in Newburyport, we may be sending it to Boston, we may be sending it someplace else, but we're making money in doing that. This was a very, very vibrant port. Okay, so abolition really did polarize this town. Many of you know that there is a Garrison Inn, that William Lloyd Garrison was born here in 1805. He is one of our most famous abolitionists. According to his biography, he got the idea about abolition from watching one of the Todd's ships go out, knowing this man was a slaver. And he thought, this is not okay. This is not right. Well, he, by 1830, is in Boston. He is writing The Liberator, publishing that. It is the foremost abolitionist newspaper. And he was invited to Newburyport in September of 1830 to speak on the subject of slavery. And I quote here, he addressed a large audience in the meeting house on Titcomb Street, then under the pastoral care of Reverend D. of Dr. Luther F. Dimmick. And this was the first of 2 speeches he was to give. But on account of the excitement created by his first address, the doors of the meeting house were closed against him. Too many people here were not ready to hear about abolition. It really did polarize this town because there were some people who were abolitionists, but many more people who relied upon the slave trade for income. There were 3 people who were actively involved in the Underground Railroad. If you know anything about this topic, you know that it came through Newburyport and went up into New Hampshire. It was Captain Alexander Graves, Mr. Jackman, and Richard Plummer. Those 3 gentlemen were known to be abolitionists. And they tried very hard to hide people any way they possibly could to get them safely to New Hampshire and on up. So, Francis Cabot Lowell. You have the Book of the Lowells out here. Great book. He opened with his partners the Boston Manufacturing Company in Waltham. How many of you have been to the Lowell Mills? Anybody been? Isn't it cool? I just went again for the second time. It's just so neat. And that, of course, that town is named for him. But after he died, his partners said, well, the Charles River just isn't enough. We've got to move to the Merrimack. Lowell expands, and and you've got the mills. And that's why it's named Lowell. But this is the beginning of our cotton and textile mills, okay? And they're all over the place. Who's picking the cotton? We don't have slaves working in the mills. Well, we have immigrant girls, right? But we don't have slaves working there. For some reason, there aren't a whole lot of people of color in New England anymore. They've kind of vanished. Well, we've pushed them to the margins of society because they're not quite equal to us. They're free, but they're not quite equal to us. So they're sort of gone. And so we can just say, oh, slavery, we're good. We're the good guys. I grew up in Ohio. We are so good, let me tell you. White hats, the whole thing. Nonsense. It's not true. So we provide the mills, the transportation, the banking, the insuring, the brokering, everything. The South would have been nothing without us. That's the thing. We were tied like this. Another one of my ancestors, somebody that you probably think of, Samuel F.B. Morse, Morse code. Yeah, he was not an abolitionist. Thought it was a very bad idea to abolish slavery. Okay, so who benefited? Just to make this as clear as possible, who benefited from the slave trade? Well, the slave
Everybody
owners.
but the slaves.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody. Everybody did. This is well after the Civil War. Speech by a South Carolina congressman. He did not actually, in this statement, he said, Massachusetts is a state more responsible under heaven than any other community in this land for the introduction of slavery into this continent, with all the curses that have followed it, that it is the nursing mother of the horrors of the Middle Passage, and that after slavery in Massachusetts was found not to pay, her slaves were sold down south for a consideration. And then their former owners thanked God and sang the long meter doxology through their noses, and that they were responsible no longer for the sin of human slavery. He didn't mention the cotton mills. He could have. I've done a micro-history on this town, right? This also applies to Bristol, Rhode Island. It applies to towns all along the coast in New England. Half the population in New York City at the time of the Revolution was enslaved. So, this is just one little micro piece of this. So we create race. Justified enslavement of Africans in terms of religion and culture. In the antebellum period before the Civil War, we have the Baptists, the Southern Baptists, split off because their Bible says slavery is okay. And the American Baptists said not so much. And we have a split with the Methodists. We have a split all over the place where you're using religion to say this is right to do. And we have this explicit theory of race. First time this is written down is in Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. This is an advertisement. I don't know if anybody's ever read it. It's an advertisement for moving to Virginia. And he says, it's just my thought that maybe they're not as equal to us in thought, in mind, in culture. So once we have gotten rid of slavery, race remains, racism remains. That's another lecture too. I do have, as I was saying to Sharon, I have a whole lot more research to do on this. Because one of the ways that people were paying for pieces of ships, they were borrowing money. Well, who were they borrowing from? There were no banks. They borrowed from very wealthy women. Those were the original banks. So, what's their implication? Right? I still don't have really good details on the Morse family. I do know he owed Paul White money, so he was drinking rum. Right? Did they send produce from the farm to the Caribbean? I don't know that yet. I hope to be able to find that out. There are Morse descendants still here. My group moved to Michigan in the early 19th century. And the Bartletts went to New Hampshire, and then, well, a lot of them stayed there. But some of them moved west. So, my husband and I were both born in the Middle West, and we're back here now. So, I think that's my last one, but I'm not sure. Yeah, it is. Okay. So, questions about this? There's so much more to say about it, but any questions? Yes?
You said that women, at the very end, is talking about women with lending money.
Yes. Because they were wealthy widows.
I didn't think women could have wealth. I thought.
Depended on who they were. And if they had an elder son who was taking over. If they didn't, or if they had a son who was in joint ownership of things, because it depended on how the will was written too. Some women were left the best bed and that was it, but many women ended up with a lot of money. Yeah, because that's who I found was loaning the money, so that the debts, you have to pay all this money back to Mrs. So-and-so.
And
Yes.
women could own property if they were not married.
Correct,
So
correct.
once they're widowed,
Yep.
they're not married.
Right, right. Other questions? Yes.
A couple of years ago, I went to Medford to the Royal Estate.
Oh, yes,
There,
yes.
The slave housing there. Is there anything like that around here in Newburyport?
That's the only existing slave quarters in the north. This is the Isaac Royal House in Medford. This is the original John Winthrop plantation, governor of Massachusetts. Yeah, yeah. That was West Indies trade too. Yeah. No, amazing place. Question?
Yeah, what about the tunnels of Newburyport?
Oh, I'm so glad somebody brought that up. The tunnels of Newburyport. I would love to go into one. In talking to several people, well, they're not. That's the thing. I mean, there's people who say, oh, they never existed. Oh, yes, they did. And they're running up along here. And I know that there was some investigation of going into the street and trying to find them. There's supposedly one out of the Bartlett House on Federal Street, because not only were slaves coming at some point, he was also smuggling during the War of 1812. Why let a war stop you, right? I mean, New England was actually talking about seceding from the country because we did not want that war, because this was our big trade. So, if somebody finds one, tell me, please, okay? Because I'd love to go in. That'd be great. Yes.
We've seen photos,
There is, but we
can't really say anything about it.
Oh, now wait a minute.
We just want to let you know that.
No, you cannot do that. Don't let them out of the building.
We have seen, we preserve, we'd rather preserve the individual's privacy, to be honest with you. But we have personally seen photos
So you are, it is. for
Send me a
real.
photo. I
I'm
won't.
not, I'm not that
we'll
close,
talk.
I'm not that close to that individual.
Okay, some sleuthing it needs to happen here.
But at least you know, I mean, now you know there is, okay?
She's just answered your question, so. Okay, that's very exciting. Yes.
I just want to know what the Africans did with all that rum.
Probably they drank it or they traded it.
Would they have traded it to Europe? I mean,
Oh, they easily could have. Easily. I mean, that is currency. And they knew that. And we're talking about complicit African chiefs who went in and had people stolen from the interior of the continent and brought them to the coast. These people didn't have a clue about the ocean or anything else. And you'd get different tribes on a ship, and we look at them as, oh, you're Africans, of course. You all speak the same language. Of course you have the same religion. No, not at all. Not at all. I can't imagine how frightening that would have been. Yes?
There's a New England legend that a lot of our rock walls were built by slaves,
Yes.
especially those traveling on the Underground Railroad. I don't know how they would have had time to stop and build the walls. Is there any evidence for that?
I am told that that is also true, but I didn't hear about the Underground Railroad part. I knew that what I had heard was that slaves had been responsible for doing a lot of the stone wall building, which of course needed to happen because that's our best crop here, right? Stones? Yeah. That's my best crop. That and poison ivy. Those are my two best crops. Yeah. So the stone walls, and I've heard that from several sources, but I don't have a primary source to share with you. Other questions? Okay, well, I think that we have a list of books that, in case you're interested,
Yes,
and
on the table, there's a list of the further reading materials if you're interested.
there's one film that I would tell you about that I think is very, very interesting, that motivated me, called Traces of the Trade, if anybody's ever seen this. It's about the DeWolf family in Bristol, Rhode Island. Worth seeing. Okay? All right. Thank you all so much for coming out.